The Constitution stipulates the U.S. government is responsible for the common defense of the United States, for the American citizens, for our physical security and safety. But it doesn't tell you how much you have to spend in order to be secure. And it also presumes that common defense applies to us, to the United States, to American citizens, not to other countries that can and should defend themselves. We enjoy a measure of safety that our ancestors would envy, and yet we're spending more today to defend ourselves against a scruffy band of miscreants than we spent to defeat the Soviet Union during the Cold War. We're spending more than we spent during the Korean War, more than in Vietnam, more frankly than under Ronald Reagan. If Ronald Reagan's defense buildup was sufficient to defeat the evil empire, it would seem that we were spending more than enough to handle the very modest challenges we're facing today.
People who want to increase defense spending are always saying we're in trouble because we have a smaller Navy, we have fewer ships than we used to, we have fewer Army brigades than we used to, we have fewer fighters in the Air Force than we did in the height of the Cold War, and therefore our enemies are going to get us. But the truth of the matter is that we don't have enemies like we did at the height of the Cold War. So we're safer, and it makes a fair amount of sense for us to spend less on the forces than we did. But actually we don't spend less. We're spending more than we did at the height of the Cold War, and buying fewer forces per dollar than we used to. And that's because the weapon systems have become more complex and in many ways more capable. So it's really not fair to make a one-to-one comparison and say, well, we have fewer things than we used to, because each platform, each Navy ship, each Air Force fighter is significantly more capable than forces were in the 1950s or 60s or even the 80s.
Today, the airborne computer is no longer a theory, nor an experiment. It's a fact, tested, functioning, practical, and restricted.
In this week-long period that we're just coming out of, where we've been reflecting on the lessons of 9/11, we've also heard repeatedly that what 9/11 shows is that we need to be vigilant. And being vigilant means we have to spend what we spend on defense now or more. Hawks are keen to latch on to 9/11 and its lessons to defend their spending priorities. But vigilance against risks or threats or dangers means being vigilant against all dangers, not just the ones that defenses are aimed against. And one of the dangers is ruining yourself with debt. We should be vigilant against that. We ought to be vigilant against the risks of overreacting to dangers and getting into wars that could be avoided. So the idea that risk reduction means spending a lot on defense is just wrong. We're always balancing risks and making choices between them, and the argument that we just have to chase one as far as possible is just a way of bankrupting ourselves ultimately.
If we're going to spend less on our military, we have to ask our military to do less. The good news is there are a number of missions that we've tasked the military with doing over the last decade or so that we could stop doing. For example, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have been costly distraction. We're now engaged in nation building in Afghanistan, something that very few Americans support, and rightly so. You don't need to build a functioning nation in Afghanistan in order to be secure from terrorism. Most of the goals of the original intervention in October of 2001 were accomplished in a matter of a few months. And we can continue to keep enormous pressure on Al-Qaeda without stationing 100,000 troops in a place like Afghanistan, which is particularly inhospitable. The other thing we need to stop doing is fight wars for our allies. The war in Libya was fought largely on the grounds that our NATO allies were concerned about what was happening in a place not far from their shores. Well, they should have been concerned, but they should have dealt with the problem. Instead, they waited for the United States to do it for them. And that's a mistake. It's a mistake that we can solve ourselves if we simply tell our allies that they have interests, that they are responsible for defending, and the United States is going to focus on our own security first and foremost.
Not only is terrorism not as big a threat as we've been told for the last 10 years, but to the extent it is the big threat that our military ought to be focused on, it's a cheap one. We go after it with what are basically niche capabilities: intelligence agencies, drones, on occasion special operations forces, and the vast majority of our military budget has nothing to do with counterterrorism. So to the extent terrorism is the threat that our military is designed for, we should focus on those things: intelligence, drone capability, and special operations forces, and that's a really small sliver in terms of budget of what we spend. So terrorism is not an argument for spending more in defense.